Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. If these reflections speak to something silent inside you, subscribe so you don't lose the path back here. Every like, every comment helps this message find those who are still searching in the dark. Now, let's begin. The quiet departure of an empath is not anger. It is revelation. Jung understood this with a clarity that still unsettles us today. Nothing destroys a person who exploited an empath more brutally than silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of awakening. There is no confrontation, no scene, no emotional explosion. Just the sudden absence of someone who once held the entire emotional architecture of the relationship together. Someone who gave freely, listened endlessly, and absorbed what others refused to face within themselves. For years you were the stabilizer, the one who soothed crises without being asked, who carried pain that wasn't yours, who held together people who could not hold themselves. You became the emotional spine for everyone else while your own spirit bent under the weight. And then one day the shift happens. Not with rage, not with resentment, but with an inner certainty that feels ancient, as if something deep within you, something forgotten, finally remembered itself. You stop explaining yourself. You stop apologizing for needing rest, space, or reciprocity. And the most devastating act of all, you stop being emotionally available to people who only valued your presence when it served them. Jung called this moment the withdrawal of projections. The empath stops allowing others to use their psyche as a storage container for everything they refuse to confront. And to those who depended on your unconscious participation, this feels like psychological warfare. Why? Because they never loved the real you. They loved the version of you that made their life easier. This is the secret Jung discovered about highly sensitive people, what the modern world calls empaths. He recognized as individuals with innate sensitiveness, a rare capacity to perceive the emotional undercurrents of others with surgical precision. But this gift has a shadow. The sensitive person becomes a vessel for the unprocessed emotions of everyone around them, a living container for pain that is not theirs, a mirror for wounds they did not create. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate." For the empath, this fate is shaped not by their own unconscious, but by the unconscious of others. This creates a tragic inversion. They heal everyone except themselves. They understand everyone except themselves. They save everyone except themselves. Jung noticed this pattern again and again. The sensitive person becomes the psychological dump site for the unmetabolized emotions of the people around them. He described this as having a porous boundary, a psyche so open that the emotions of others seep in long before the empath even notices. This leads to what I call the helper's dilemma. The more you protect others from their own emotional responsibilities, the more dependent they become on your strength, and the less they develop their own. You do not become a person in their lives, you become a function, a soothing mechanism, a shock absorber, a therapist they never pay and rarely appreciate. These relationships operate under what can only be described as an unconscious contract. I will carry your emotional burdens, and in return, you will give me conditional acceptance. The tragedy is that neither person knows this contract exists until the empath breaks it. Jung wrote, "We do not liberate ourselves by condemning the problem, but by becoming conscious of it." But in these dynamics, only one person ever becomes conscious: the empath. They adjust, bend, soothe, absorb, sacrifice, and disappear into the emotional needs of others. The people they support remain psychologically static, frozen in their own avoidance. This is why Jung insisted that individuation, becoming who you truly are, requires what he called the courage to disappoint. For the empath, this courage feels like betrayal, because their identity has been built on the belief that being good means being available. But the moment arrives, the moment that changes everything. Jung observed this as the first stage of empathic individuation, the moment of psychological clarity. It rarely comes as a dramatic explosion. It comes as a quiet recognition, a small interaction that suddenly reveals the entire architecture of the relationship. A single comment, a dismissive gesture, a familiar pattern, and suddenly you see the truth. You were never valued as a person, only as a source of emotional labor. Your kindness was mistaken for obligation, your empathy for permission, your silence for consent. Worst of all, they never noticed you were drowning under the weight of what you carried for them. Jung called this awakening the first act of independence. It is the moment when you stop justifying behavior that harms you and start asking the question you were always too loyal to ask. Why am I accepting so little in return for giving so much? If you have ever experienced this moment and that sudden shattering clarity, you know exactly how irreversible it feels. This recognition becomes the doorway to a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. You did not simply get taken advantage of. You participated in your own depletion, not because you were weak, not because you were naive, but because you were conditioned, often since childhood, to equate love with self-erasure. Jung understood this profoundly. He called it the first movement of the shadow, when the empath finally realizes that the suffering they blamed on others was partially sustained by their own inability to refuse. This is not self-blame, it is self-revelation. Once this truth rises to the surface, the psyche initiates what I call the great reorientation. Your energy, which has always flowed outward, begins to turn inward for the first time in years, maybe decades. This is not withdrawal, it is reclamation. You stop reflexively saying yes. You stop cushioning others from the consequences of their choices. You stop absorbing every emotional vibration in the room as if it were your responsibility. And perhaps for the first time in your life, you ask yourself questions that were never allowed space to exist. What do I want? What do I need? Who am I when I am not carrying everyone else? Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." But for the sensitive person, this choice feels like foreign territory. Their entire life has been shaped around pleasing, softening, adapting, and accommodating. Authenticity feels like rebellion. Boundaries feel like aggression. Self-care feels like abandonment. This is what Jung referred to as the discomfort of authenticity. You begin setting small boundaries, gentle refusals, delayed responses, moments of silence. You take time for yourself without apologizing. You start choosing rest over rescue, solitude over self-sacrifice. To those who have depended on your constant availability, these changes feel like betrayal. But they are not betrayal, they are birth. Here is where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. Every boundary you set does not only protect you, it forces others to meet themselves. By refusing to enable emotional avoidance, you become a mirror reflecting their undeveloped coping mechanisms. Your absence reveals the labor they never saw. Your silence reveals the responsibility they never carried. Your boundary reveals the imbalance they never questioned. This is why the empath's quiet exit is so psychologically devastating. It removes the anesthesia. Jung described this moment as the dissolution of participation mystique, the unconscious merging of your emotional world with someone else's. When this merging breaks, you stop absorbing their emotions and instead begin observing them. You are no longer part of their internal emotional machinery, and they feel the loss immediately. The space you once filled becomes undeniable. The constant reassurance you provided, gone. The emotional buffering you performed, removed. The stability you offered, no longer available. Your quiet absence becomes louder than any argument you could have made. People suddenly realize how heavily they leaned on you, how little they gave in return, and how dependent they were on a form of support they never acknowledged. For them, your silence is not silence, it is exposure. If you've ever gone completely quiet with someone who repeatedly took you for granted, you know this truth. Your silence speaks in a language their conscience cannot ignore. Jung knew this was not cruelty. It was self-preservation. Sensitive people withdraw not to punish others but to stop bleeding emotionally. But those accustomed to your sacrifices experience your absence as abandonment. Not because they loved you deeply, but because they relied on you unconsciously to regulate their emotions. This is what I call psychological accountability. When the empath steps away, the other person must finally confront the truth. The relationship was never balanced. It was built on unspoken emotional labor, and now the source of that labor is gone. This is where the brutality of the quiet exit becomes undeniable. The empath does nothing, absolutely nothing, yet their absence dismantles the illusion the other person lived inside. People respond in predictable ways. Some become angry, calling you selfish, cold, or changed. But Jung teaches us, anger is often a projection of the shadow, the qualities people refuse to admit in themselves. Others attempt what modern psychology calls hoovering, sudden affection, sudden promises, sudden emotional revelations, anything to pull you back into the role that benefited them. But Jung warned, where the will to power dominates, love is absent. These gestures are not love. They are attempts to regain control. But a rare few, the ones capable of genuine growth, will take responsibility. They will see the imbalance. They will acknowledge their dependence. They will face the truth. This, Jung said, is the beginning of real transformation, not for the empath, but for the one who finally must confront the emptiness your presence once filled. Jung observed that this confrontation, the moment when someone loses the empath they depended on, activates what he called the shadow crisis. It is the collapse of the comfortable narrative they built about themselves. Because without you there to cushion truth, they must finally face the person they actually are, not the version you reassured them into believing. And this is where the empath's quiet exit becomes transformative. Your silence becomes a mirror they cannot break, cannot argue with, and cannot escape. They see the selfishness they denied, the entitlement they excused, the emotional immaturity they normalized, the dependency they masked as affection. You didn't expose them. They exposed themselves the moment you stepped away. But while others begin their crisis, something entirely different unfolds within you. Jung described it as the return of the rejected self. All the parts of you that were pushed aside to serve others, the needs you buried, the desires you postponed, the boundaries you silenced, begin to rise like long-forgotten spirits demanding recognition. This is the empath's internal renaissance. You start remembering who you were before life convinced you to be indispensable to everyone but yourself. You reclaim your time, your attention, your emotional bandwidth. You realize your sensitivity is not a curse. It's a compass. A tool for navigation, not a leash for others to hold. And yet this phase brings its own discomfort. Because once you stop absorbing everyone's emotions, you finally feel your own. All the fatigue you ignored, all the resentment you minimized, all the grief you carried quietly. It comes back not to punish you, but to be acknowledged at last. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the empath's darkness, the pain of realizing how deeply you betrayed yourself in your attempt to protect others. But this awareness is liberation. It marks the birth of what Jung called psychological sovereignty. You no longer need external validation to confirm your worth. You no longer shape yourself to avoid disappointing others. You no longer participate in emotional arrangements that require your self-erasure. Your sensitivity becomes disciplined. Your empathy becomes conscious. Your presence becomes intentional. And the people around you feel the difference. Those who relied on your weakness will resent your strength. Those who valued your silence will fear your clarity. Those who benefited from your compliance will call your boundaries selfish. But the ones meant for you, the ones capable of genuine connection, will meet your sovereignty with respect, not resistance. This is the moment Jung believed separates unconscious relationships from conscious ones. Because when the empath stops enabling dysfunction, only real connection survives. Everything else collapses. Jung noticed something remarkable during this stage of inner reconstruction. When the empath withdraws their energy, they stop being a supporting character in everyone else's story, and finally become the protagonist of their own. This shift is subtle, but it is seismic. You begin making decisions not out of obligation, but out of alignment. Not to maintain peace, but to preserve truth. Not to avoid conflict, but to protect your spirit. This is where the old version of you begins to die. The version who tolerated disrespect, who minimized their intuition, who softened their boundaries to keep others comfortable. And with that death comes the birth of someone others barely recognize. Someone clear, someone grounded, someone who no longer negotiates their worth. Jung referred to this stage as the reorganization of the psyche, the moment when you stop orbiting around other people's needs and return to your psychological center. But that return has consequences. When you no longer absorb the emotional chaos of others, they must finally face their own. The one who always soothed their anger is gone. The one who diffused every conflict is silent. The one who carried the emotional weight of the relationship simply puts it down. And the sound of that weight hitting the floor echoes louder than any argument ever could. Jung wrote, "What you resist not only persists, it grows." Those around you begin to drown in emotions you once carried for them. Their insecurity, their guilt, their unresolved childhood wounds, their dependence on your stability. Your withdrawal brings all of it to the surface. Some will respond with hostility, trying to pull you back into the old dynamic with accusations, guilt, or manufactured crisis. Others will collapse inward, overwhelmed by feelings they never developed the skills to regulate. But a rare few, the ones capable of growth, will have an awakening of their own. Your silence becomes their initiation into responsibility. Your absence becomes their first encounter with self-awareness. Your boundary becomes the mirror through which they finally see their own shadow. This is why the empath's quiet exit is so devastating. It is not an attack, it is an unveiling. You did not harm them. You simply stopped protecting them from themselves. And now they stand face to face with the very behaviors that drove you away. Jung believed this confrontation is the beginning of true transformation, but only for those willing to look inward. Most will not. They will cling to the story that you changed, because acknowledging their role in your silence would require the kind of honesty they've spent their entire lives avoiding. But here's the truth Jung uncovered. When an empath walks away, the relationship doesn't end. The illusion does. As the old illusion collapses, something extraordinary begins to take shape within you. Not anger, not resentment, not the desire to prove anything, but a quiet, immovable solidity, a psychological center that cannot be manipulated, persuaded, or shaken. This is the stage Jung described as the formation of inner sovereignty. You stop chasing clarity from others. You stop waiting for accountability that will never come. You stop explaining your worth in languages people were never willing to learn. Instead, you reclaim the parts of yourself you abandoned. Your intuition, your depth, your emotional intelligence, your spiritual discernment. These pieces return to you like exiled fragments finally finding their way home. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And that is exactly what begins to happen. But with this return comes another profound realization. Many of the relationships you once sustained were built on your absence, not your presence. They depended on your silence, not your voice, on your compliance, not your authenticity, on your emotional labor, not mutual connection. When you re-enter your life with clarity, those relationships can no longer survive. Not because you destroyed them, but because consciousness always dissolves structures rooted in unconsciousness. This is the deeper reason the empath's quiet exit hits with such force. Your silence exposes the architecture of the relationship. Every imbalance, every expectation, every unspoken dependency, every piece of emotional work that was never yours to carry. In your absence, the truth becomes undeniable. They did not lose you. They lost the version of themselves that existed only because you absorbed their shadow. And now, without you, they must face the emotional terrain they neglected for years. The loneliness they masked with your attention, the insecurity they numbed with your validation, the chaos they outsourced to your stability. This is the psychological earthquake Jung understood so clearly. When the unconscious erupts into consciousness, the old personality is shattered. Your withdrawal triggers this eruption. Some will attempt to rebuild themselves, others will seek a new empath to carry their burdens. But for you, the one who awakened, a new era begins. The era of self-trust, the era of boundaries shaped not by fear but by wisdom. The era of relationships chosen consciously rather than tolerated unconsciously. You become someone different, someone whole, someone whose silence is not empty but sacred, someone whose presence is no longer available to those who never learned how to value it. One day you look at your reflection and realize, The version of you who once begged for reciprocity is gone. The version who accepted crumbs is gone. The version who sacrificed everything to keep others emotionally stable is gone. What remains is the sovereign self, the person Jung believed every sensitive soul was meant to become. If you've ever reached this stage, this quiet, irreversible transformation, comment, "I didn't leave, I awakened." Jung believed that every profound transformation requires a sacrifice, not of love, not of kindness, but of the illusions that kept you small. The empath's quiet exit is that sacrifice. It marks the moment when you stop abandoning yourself in order to keep others comfortable. The moment when your nervous system, exhausted from years of emotional labor, finally whispers, "No more." And for the first time you listen. This listening is sacred. It becomes the gateway to a life built on authenticity rather than appeasement, clarity rather than confusion, connection rather than codependency. As you grow into this new version of yourself, something beautiful happens. Your sensitivity stops functioning as a wound and starts functioning as an instrument of perception. You begin to discern who is capable of meeting you, who is capable of growing with you, and who only knew how to take from you. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. But when you awaken, fate dissolves, patterns dissolve, cycles dissolve, and you begin shaping yourself consciously rather than surviving unconsciously. You discover peace, not the fragile peace bought through self-sacrifice, but the deep, steady peace that emerges when your inner world no longer depends on anyone else's approval. Those who once misused your kindness will feel the loss of your presence more intensely than you ever felt the burden of theirs. Not because you were dependent on them, but because they were dependent on the parts of you they never learned to value. Your silence becomes the lesson they never wanted but desperately needed. And as they confront the void left behind, you walk forward, lighter, clearer, sovereign. This sovereignty isn't loud, it isn't grand, it isn't dramatic. It is calm, it is rooted, it is unmistakably yours. You no longer fear the loneliness that comes with leaving the wrong people behind, because you finally meet the one person who was missing all along, yourself. Jung believed that individuation, the journey toward one's true self, is not a path for the faint of heart. It is a descent into the shadow, a confrontation with every pattern that once kept you in emotional bondage, and the emergence of a self that can finally withstand its own truth. This is the empath's real transformation, not becoming harder, not becoming colder, but becoming conscious. The quiet exit was never revenge, it was resurrection. And those who were meant to walk with you will meet you on the other side, not with need, not with entitlement, but with reciprocity. If you've ever risen from your own silence, if you've ever reclaimed your voice after years of being unheard, comment, "I didn't disappear, I returned to myself." And if this journey resonates with you, your path is already unfolding. Walk it with clarity, walk it with courage, walk it with the consciousness Jung believed was humanity's greatest achievement. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark. One awakened mind helping another remember. Together, we move beyond the dark.